Hello everyone. How are you folks doing today? My name is Armando, and in this video, now we're going to be talking about the Massie murders. Now, there's always, people say, "Oh, the local people here howling or against the mainland or whatever." But this, if you understood what happened, this was back in 1931, long time ago. You understood what happened at that time. There was a lot of racial prejudice going on, and that carried on over years and years. And so the sentiment against mainlanders or so-called howlies would say, that was carried on for many years. So anyway, let's get started. What are the Massie murders? Well, there was a Massie trial for what was known as the Massie Affair. It was a 1932 criminal trial that took place in Honolulu, Hawaii. Socialite Grace Fortescue, along with several accomplices, was charged with the murder of the well-known prizefighter Joseph Kahahai. Fortescue was the mother of Thalia Massie, who brought charges that Kahahai was one of a group of men who had raped her. So before I get into the story, let me give you a little bit of background of the Massie family and of the police time. Now, the Massie family. Grace Hubbard Fortescue, maiden name is Grace Hubbard Bell, is the granddaughter of Gardiner Green Hubbard, the first president of the National Geographic Society. Her father, Charles James Bell, was the first cousin of inventor Alexander Graham Bell. Her marriage to Major Roland Granville Fortescue, an out-of-wedlock son of Robert Barnwell Roosevelt, did not leave her as financially successful as she would have wished. But she nevertheless kept up appearances and raised her daughter, Thalia, with an upper American class lifestyle. She wasn't getting too much money at the time. Now, Grace Thalia Fortescue married Lieutenant Thomas Massie, a rising United States Navy officer. In 1930, Massie arrived at Pearl Harbor, where Thalia considered herself above the rest of the officers' wives and soon became an outcast. Marriage apparently was terribly not successful to start, with degenerated into heavy drinking and public fights. Thalia has had a second miscarriage shortly prior to the incident and was on quote-unquote probation with her husband, who wrote an informal set of conditions under which she would continue marriage. So their marriage was not that good at the time. Now, talking about the Honolulu police, I'm just giving you a background of the Honolulu police. In 1931, the Honolulu police force was bitterly split between two factions. The McIntosh faction, led by Captain Nelson McIntosh, which consisted mostly of white officers, and the Howell faction, led by Deputy Sheriff David Howell, which consisted mostly of police officers of a Hawaiian heritage. Both factions had political backing. McIntosh was a choice of Hawaii's business elite, while Howell had the backing of still politically powerful Hawaiian royalty. So two factions against each other. McIntosh was regarded as a racist by indigenous Hawaiians, while Howe's faction was considered corrupt by Mike McIntosh's faction. Patrick K. Gleason, the sheriff of Honolulu, tried to keep peace within his department as he needed the votes of both factions to win the election. So things got pretty heated in August 1931 when Ha was forced into retirement. While the retirement itself was not finalized, McIntosh temporarily took over his position with all of the detectives formally reporting to him. However, as McIntosh was hostile to detectives from Howe's faction, Sheriff Gleason would give some of them direct assignments, thus retaining the parallel command structure. Now, so that's pretty much the background. You can see there's two factions of the police department, and it gave you a background of Thalia Massie, husband, not marriage is on shaky ground. So let's get to the events of what actually happened on September 12th and 13th of 1931. So, in the evening hour of Saturday, September 12th, 1931, the Massies, the Browns, and the Bransons, they're all Navy couples, attended a Navy event at the LOI Inn, a Waikiki nightclub. At about 11:30 p.m., Thalia had an argument with a Lieutenant Stogsall, which ended up with her slapping an officer and storming out. So, Thomas, not having witnessed the event, assumed she was tired and gone home, and stayed at the nightclub. Meanwhile, at some time between 11:30 and 12, Thalia left the LOI Inn. She claimed to have walked towards Waikiki Park, a dance hall a few hundred meters from the nightclub, which had a dance that night as well. The dance was normally scheduled to end at 11:45, but ended closer to 11:55 that night. Now, it said sometime between 12:20 and 12:45 Sunday morning, Thalia was picked up by a car driving along Ala Moana Road, then a relatively isolated road that connected Waikiki to Honolulu, which is often used as a lover's lane by locals. Now, the car was occupied by the Behringer and Clark families, who were the first to definitely wreck Thalia after she left LOI Inn. Okay, so according to their testimony, Thalia claimed that she was assaulted and robbed, but not raped, by several Hawaiian men. She declined police intervention and asked to be taken home. She got there at about 1 a.m. However, the driver made several mistakes while driving there, so it was not the shortest route, as Thomas was still not home and she did not have the keys. So Thalia had to break through the back door to get inside the house. So the last stand said LOI Inn was supposed to stop at midnight. However, the patrons did not let the orchestra stop until 1 a.m. So, at that time, Thomas tried to look for his wife once more. He but gave up and went for an after party at Rigby's home, where the Navy officers were supposed to meet after the evening. He was accompanied by Lieutenant Branson. His wife left with their car. However, there was no party at Rigby, so Branson fell asleep there, and Thomas went for some late snacks. Thomas tried to call his wife to make sure she had arrived safely. After several calls, she finally answered. He told Thomas to come home immediately if something terrible had happened to her. Thomas took the car and left, leaving the sleeping Branson behind. So he's heading home at this point in time. As Thomas arrived home, Thalia told him about the assault. Over her objections, Thomas immediately phoned the police, who arrived to take her statement. Initially, she could not provide any details at all, stating that it's too dark to identify any of the men or to see any details of the car they emerged from. So this is important. This is her first story now. It's too dark. She cannot see anything in the car, the details of the car. That's story number one from her. However, Thalia changed her story several hours later. She changes it, not only describing the assailants as locals, but giving police a license number. Wow, where did she get that license number now? Within hours, the police arrested a Japanese-American man named Horace Ida. Ida was not entirely surprised at first, as only a few hours earlier he had been involved in a near collision while driving his sister's car with several friends, including Kahahabai and Ahakuelo. Although there was no damage, an argument broke out with the couple driving the other car, which culminated in Kahahabai slugging the woman. Upon his arrival at the police station, Horace Ida, arriving at the police station, the charge with the altercation never brought up. Instead, he found to his dismay that he was being charged with rape. Okay? So, now, at first glance, the story seemed to be credible. Thalia's license plate was off by only one digit or letter, and her description of the man, Ida, and his friends was fairly accurate. However, it later became known that the police, taking Thalia's statement, had in fact told her both pieces of information. Apparently, after hearing the name and description in the initial complaint filed by the woman driver, Attorney Charles Riccio, a legal advisor with the Colorado State Patrol, offers the following account of the incident involving Horace Ida. Now, this is the story about the accident of Horace Ida and the other couple. Now, Horace Ida, a young Japanese man, had borrowed his sister's 2-year-old car and attended a luau accompanied by his pals Joe Kahabai, Benny Ahakuelo, David Takai, and Henry Chang. At about 12:30 a.m., Horace suggested they call it a night. He and his friends piled into the car and left the luau. Now, as the car passed through the intersection in downtown Honolulu, Horace barely missed colliding with an automobile coming from the opposite direction. There was no contact between the two cars. Both drivers stopped and everyone piled out to argue the fine points of Hawaiian motor vehicle. So, that's what happened. The occupants of the other car were Mr. and Mrs. People. Mrs. People was voicing her opinion of Horace Ida's driving skills, and Big Joe Kahabai, all 6 feet and more of him, hauled off and punched her in the face. Mrs. Peoples was equal to the challenge. She gave as good as she got. Clenched her fists, wound up, and Big Joe, surprised, slugged him in the mouth. She wasn't going to take it from him. The incident was about to become a Donnybrook. However, cooler heads prevailed. The Peoples drove off to the police station to report the incident. Now, At the station, the Peoples gave Horace Ida's license plate as 58-895, and the police put out an all-points bulletin for the car and its occupants. At about the same time, the police learned of the Inn Alamoana Park, and so it was only natural that they would assume that the occupants of the Ida uh, car were more than likely the perpetrators of the assault of Thalia Massie. Now, so they tried to connect the two incidents. Horace Ida and his friends were eventually located through the car's license plate and were brought before Thalia at the police station. She was unable to identify Horace Ida, who was wearing a brown leather jacket when she saw him. Now, when asked the license number of the assailant's car, she did not remember it, but later heard the plate number 58-895 being broadcast at the police station. So, she heard it at the police station. The next day, under further questioning, Thalia's story began to change. It's now changing again. She now remembered that one of her assailant's car was 58-805. Okay? So, only one digit was different from the number of Horace Ida's plate. Now, to the police, the case against Horace Ida and his friends began to look stronger. 5 men insisted they were not part of any assault on a white woman walking through the darkness of John Eno Road. They explained their movements on the night at length, but the police were not persuaded. The 5 young men were indicted and charged with rape and assault. Now, Rear Admiral Yates Sterling Jr., Commandant of the U.S. Navy's 14th Naval District 9, which included the Hawaiian Islands. I heard he was a racist person too. Indicated that his first inclination was to lynch the accused assailants, but that they must give, quote, the authorities a chance to carry out the law and not interfere. As the case developed, facts in Thalia's story immediately appeared. In order to have assaulted Thalia, an event so far unproven to have even occurred, it would have been extremely difficult to have them been involved in the near accident across town. And so the police themselves split on the case. Many of the detectives were locals who saw the case was a sham, and when they were denied access to the courtroom, started to talk directly to the press. So that's why I was bringing up about the difference in the police split faction. While the good citizens of Honolulu waited for the trial to begin, rumors began to develop and spread throughout the city. So here comes the rumors. There were those who whispered that Thalia had not been raped at all. It was said that she was having an illicit relationship with one of the 5 Beach Boy suspects, and that she was on her way to a rendezvous with him when she found him in the company of 4 drunken friends. Now, this is just a rumor, okay? So it was also speculated that Thalia was having an affair with one of Tommy's shipmates. So when Tommy came home after the party, as the gossip went, he found his friend in the act with his wife, and it was Tommy who beat up his wife and broke her. So those are just rumors. Grace Fortescue, enraged by the stories and what she saw as an attempt to sully the name of her daughter and the family, started a public campaign to attack the defendants. However, the case quickly fell apart in court. Now, After a 3-week trial and lengthy jury deliberation, the jurors declared themselves deadlocked and a mistrial was declared. So it ended up in a mistrial. Now, talking about Grace Fortescue she wasn't willing to wait for another trial. So what did she do? She first arranged for the kidnapping and vicious beating of Ida. Then talked Thomas into kidnapping Kahahabai, the darkest skinned of the 5 defendants, with help of 2 Navy enlisted men, Albert O. Jones and Edward J. Lord. Now, Kahahabai underwent interrogation as Grace, Thomas, and 2 Navy men attempted to beat a confession out of him. Eventually, one of the group of 4 shot Kahahabai, so he was killed. Debating what to do, the group eventually decided to dump Kahahabai's body off Coco Hill, at the time a desolate area far away from urban Honolulu. Although he would eventually be found, it seemed to them unlikely that anyone would even care. They wrapped Kahahabai in a sheet and put him in Fortescue's rented car, so they pulled down the shades of the car. So he was in the back seat, pull the shades down to hide the interior. Well, however, a police motorcyclist alerted to the kidnapping saw the blinds and considered it suspicious. He pulled him over, discovered Kahahabai's body, and immediately arrested all 4 on suspicion of murder. Now, so they all were charged for murder. Now, Clarence Darrow decided to take on the group's defense for the sum of $30,000. That was a lot of money back in those days. This is 1932. Now, Clarence Darrow, this is during the Depression. He lost everything. He was poor, so he came out of retirement. But there was 2 reasons why he took the case. Number 1 was the money, of course, and number 2 was he never seen Hawaii, so he wanted to go to Hawaii. So, Clarence Darrow, and he was very, very famous in the mainland. He was brought out of retirement by Eva Stotesbury, an old family friend and wife of Edward Stotesbury. Throughout the trial, Thalia presented herself as an innocent victim. The prosecutor, John Kelly, played on her feeling of superiority. She became enraged, ripped up a piece of evidence, and stormed from the stand. Although this would seem to be a prosecution victory, the court erupted in supportive applause from the spectators. Now, the jury returned a verdict of manslaughter rather than murder. Okay? Racial tensions were so high that everyone expected another hung jury. Now, the mainland press exploded with even more stories, and the situation in Hawaii grew more tense. Martial law was considered by Admiral Sterling if rioting were to begin, as he had considered imposing it from the start. Now there was also, I read about Randolph Hearst. Remember, he was owned the newspaper. He made a comment like, "Well, we should send a battleship over there to rescue them." I mean, those are kinds of comments. But the tension, the anti-Hawaiian sentiment in the was very high at that time. So it was really bad back then. Okay, so anyway, after a flurry of diplomatic maneuvering between Washington, D.C. and Honolulu, martial law was avoided. Instead, under pressure from the Navy, Territorial Governor Lawrence M. Judd 10-year sentences of the convicted killers to 1 hour to be served in his office. So they went to his office and they had tea with him. 1 hour. It's their sentence. They were supposed to be, it's a 10-year sentence. They were supposed to go to jail for 10 years. Wow, can you imagine how other people felt? And the anti-police. Days later, the entire group, including the Massies, the two other Navy men, Fortescue and Darrow, boarded a ship and left the island in turmoil. Talia and Massie divorced in 1934. Only 2 years later, they divorced. She committed suicide in 1963. He died in 1987. I heard he had some problems and was released from the Navy, and I don't have all the details, but I heard he had some issues. But anyway, Grace Hubbard Fortescue died in 1979 and is buried in Arlington National. So Grace Fortescue, what I heard is that she inherited, a lot. She lived, a long life, but she inherited a lot of money. Inheritance. Albert Jones died on September 23rd, 1966. Edward Lord died in 1967. Now, in 1966, while being interviewed by author Peter Van Slingerland, Albert O. Jones admitted that he was the one who shot Joseph Mahler. Now, there was something called Pinkerton investigation of the Ala case. So let's talk a little bit about that. Although the prosecution's lead witness, Thalia Massie, had left the territory and could not be forced to return to testify, four surviving Ala defendants could not be exonerated or convicted. As Peter Van Slingland wrote, Congress, the Navy, and the mainland public opinion would not allow the charges to be dropped without good reason. Before the subsequent dismissal of the charges, Governor Judd hired the Pinkerton's National Detective Agency to further investigate and review the evidence. The Pinkerton Agency responded with a 279-page report in which the introductory letter stated, an analysis of the reports of our representative together with the reports and statements of the Attorney General's office, the office of the public prosecutor, and the police department, also the testimony at the trial of the defendant, makes it impossible to escape the conviction that the kidnapping and assault was not caused by those accused, with the attendant circumstances alleged by Mrs. Massie. However, because of the victim's departure and the uncertainty of the time, context, it became impossible to ever truly determine the actual guilt or innocence of the defendant. So, that's a long story, but anyway, this Massie murders of 1931 was, can you imagine? They got away with murder, Grace Fortescue got away with all of them got away with murder of Joe Kahalabay. He was killed. An innocent man was murdered. So when you ask the question, well, why do people hate Hollis? Why do people hate Greenland? Well, I think it's a good reason why. Today it's a lot different. I mean, you don't have this kind of open racism or they wouldn't. I don't think the people here would allow that kind of crap to happen today. It would be people would protest like crazy. It's a lot different today. Thank God. Glad we Now, there's no in Hawaii. There's no majority race. You know, we're all this is a melting pot, and there's all different races in Hawaii. There's no majority here, but in at that time, as you can see by this trial and what happened, and what the end result, these people got away with murder. And so, can you imagine? Put yourself in this, you know, during this time, you know, and can you imagine the sentiment and feeling of the people, the local people at that time? It was terrible. And the hate against Hollies, the white people at that time, that was terrible. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this story. Mahalo for watching, and ahoy ho.